Hi, welcome to this lecture on environmental adaptation of animals. And this lecture is still continuing on the introduction of animals and environments. And now we will consider on what are the mechanisms and origin of this adaptation and what does the animal or environment mean. Well, how the animals are working, we can think on two ways. On the left-hand side, you can see that, okay, what is the mechanisms or by which this function is accomplished? So now we are thinking on very mechanistic way of the machine called the animal, which has several different molecules that are interacting each other and then causing that they can survive or not survive in this environment. And then on the right-hand side, there's the evolution. How did that mechanism come from? So what is the evolution of this animal? And what is the evolution of this protein, for example? Where does that come from to make this adaptation or tolerance possible? And one example on this adaptation question is I made ages ago some studies with crucian carp that is living in small ponds, can live about half a year without any oxygen. And I studied with two different ways. On the left-hand side, there's an isolated single cardiac myocytes to see that, okay, what is the function of the heart when there is oxygen available or when there is not oxygen available. And then on the other hand, I was able to get some help to isolate the channel coding genes and put them in cell lines and just test the protein levels. So how these proteins are working and then comparing the results. And then, although I think this looks pretty simple experiment, but then when I was having a lunch with some of my friends that are not scientists and trying to describe that, okay, this is the thing that I'm going to make because I want to understand that how they are, what is the mechanism, how they are adapting. Some of my friends were just saying that, okay, why are you doing it? Because we know that these animals are adapting. So adaptation for them meant that, okay, it's some kind of magical bullet that makes this animal survive in the environment. So if it's a magical bullet, then you don't have to worry. You just can continue on different subjects. But I wanted to get a little bit more sure that, okay, what is. But on the cardiac tissue, I will continue a little bit later on this course, but let's start with something more visual, like a firefly. Firefly is producing light, and in the back side of the animal, there is a light organ, and that is producing this light. And as you can see from the microscope slide, there are some tubes, plenty of these tubes. And they are gas-filled tubes that are bringing oxygen to each light organ. So that gives some kind of indication that, okay, oxygen is pretty important for this light production. And when we are going on cellular level, on these light-emitting cells, they are near the gas transport tubules, so the oxygen reaches the cells, goes inside the cells, and used by mitochondria. Well, mitochondria are using ATP, producing ATP because there is oxygen available, and then there is plenty of ATP in the cell, and luciferin is modulated by this ATP to produce luciferonyl AMP. But that's the place where this catalysis stops, because the oxygen is used by these mitochondria. But when the cell is producing nitric oxide, then nitric oxide is preventing oxygen consumption in the mitochondria. Then the oxygen is available to interact with luciferase AMP, and then there's electron excited product that is releasing photons, meaning that it's making light. So now we understand very simple process that seems to be quite fine-tuning with several cell components that so how this light is affected, how this light is produced. But because if you are using ATP for this kind of process, it's always a sacrifice. And especially if you are flying in darkness, the predators can easily see where you are flying if you have lights on. And when they've been ages ago in 60s trying to see on the backyard that okay how they are flying or flashing, when the animal is starts to fly, it will give 3 flashes, then fly a little bit, completely darkness, and then again 3 lights, then fly with the lights off, and then 3 flashes, etc., etc. So it has to have some kind of meaning with this light. But because it's using ATP for this product, and because it's easy prey, because it's when the lights are on, it has to have it's always a sacrifice. So it had to have some kind of benefit. And where it's using this light, it's attracting females. So that's why the light production is affecting on sexual and natural selection. And this makes it's a benefit, because if you have good light and you are having it in the right flashes, you attract the females, you get more children and grandchildren, and that's why your genes are going on the next generations. So that's why the flashing has adaptive significance. And how it's produced then in the evolution, how they can have some molecules that are producing this light. Well, animals almost never start anything from the scratch, that okay, now let's build a molecule that is producing light. No. They are using structures that already are on hand for other reason, and then modulate it a little bit, and that's the way you can get the light producing organ. Like this luciferase producing is producing this reaction, so oxygen is reacting with luciferase AMP to produce a light. But the luciferase is at the same time, it's just one enzyme that is oxidal reductase. Oxidal reductase are enzymes that are taking electrode from one molecule and put the electrode on another molecule. And these are very typical in electron transport chains that are in the mitochondria. So we have oxidal reductases, and one of these, oxidal reductase in the flight fly, has been a little bit modulated and used in the cytosol to produce light. So there can have some kind of interesting evolution background also on the molecular level. But sometimes this evolution goes a little bit weird. So we can have organs that are not having any kind of common ancestor, although they look the same. Over here we have octopus and fish eye, and on the morphology level they look pretty similar. There's a lens, a muscle that is affecting on the size of the lens, and then retina, which means the photoreceptors, and then there is a connection to the brains. But then, when we are going on cellular level, the octopus eye has been developed by very clever engineers. So the light is going directly on the photoreceptors, and then the cables are on the opposite side and connecting it to brain. And these connections can be quite easily get all the necessary oxygen or sugar by blood. But then in the fish, that's not very good engineering. They put all the cables first, and then the light must go through all the integrating neurons to reach the photoreceptors. And that's why, first of all, the integrating neurons must be colorless. And that's why the integrating neurons must get the sugar and the oxygen without any blood vessels. So you can't have any blood in the eye of vertebrates, because otherwise the only color that we could see is red. So sometimes the mechanisms and in the animals can have been developed independently, like the eye. Okay, then what is the animal and what is the environment? We almost must think that, okay, we are the same person that we were when we were born. Well, are we? Well, we can test it. We can use untypical isotope of iron for a short period. We can see that, okay, the iron in our molecule will be replaced. So in molecular level, we are not a discrete material subject. Well, that's why the iron, we are also time excreting iron that makes our feces brown, but then we need also iron from the environment in our food. So our molecules are all the time changing. They are not all the time same. And then, if you think a typical cell in our body, for most of our cells, the environment that they are facing is actually internal. So only our skin is facing the normal environment that we think. But then for other places there is a blood or whatever. That's called the environment. And that's why the internal environment actually can be similar with the external environment, or it can be different. And however, when we are thinking on the environmental adaptation, we quite often think whole animal level, and environment means that, okay, what about on the if we are thinking of fish, what about what happens there in the lake, or if we are thinking on terrestrial animals, so what is the climate, etc. And for these things we can have two ways. We can have conformity or regulation. So if we have, for example, temperature conformity and think about ectotherms like fish, the internal temperature is the same as the external temperature. So quite often several animals are not regulating their temperature at all. But then they might do, like humans. But our temperature, we try to keep quite near the 37 degrees of Celsius. But still, we can't just divide animals on this scale always. But they can have They can be temperature conformity like a fish, but at the same time this fish can be chloride regulation. So they try to keep the chloride inside the animal, chloride concentration inside the animal constant, but then temperature can vary. And that leads to homeostasis. And in good old Claude Bernard, already in 19th century, said that, okay, the external environment in where the animal is placed is very important, and then the stability of internal environment is the condition of free and independent existence. And later on, these were combined on the homeostasis term to mean that, okay, we try to keep, for example, our blood sugar level quite constant, our sodium level constant, chloride level constant, etc. In the internal environment. And what does it mean? Well, very simple way to keep something constant, we can think on hormones. We have endocrine organs that are releasing hormones in the circulation, and that will of course increase the hormone concentration. And then we have receptor cells, and somehow quite often these receptor cells are releasing something that is causing the negative feedback. So more that there is a hormone, more there is active receptor cells that are giving this negative feedback, and then there is a less hormone secretion from the endocrine organ. And that's why the hormone concentration can be very constant throughout the year. And then we have to think on what is the scale of physiological response. We can have completely different response in acute or chronic. So when moving from very cold and dark Finland to anywhere more milder climate or even hot climate, in the first day of heat exposure, practically no one can walk for 100 minutes walk. But then if these persons are staying for 1 week, there is maybe 20% or much they can take, people can much easier tolerate walking in this climate. So there is completely different response in acute responses than in chronic responses. So we are the responses are depending on the history. So if we are already used to warm climate or cold climate, then the changes are, we think that changes from that background. So that's why, for example, if the temperature is rising a little by little, we get used to it. But if we are having ice cold snow and then going in sauna, that's a very good example of acute responses. So now we learned that we can have acute changes that happens now, and then we can have chronic changes that happens later. But actually we have 5 different frames in which these physiological changes can happen. First of all, we can divide these 5 on direct responses on this external environment or internally programmed responses. And first of all, we have these acute changes. So when we are changing the environment, then the response happens practically immediately. When we start running, our heart rate increase very soon. And these changes are reversible, and they don't have to have any kind of changes in protein expression, etc. But then we have these chronic changes that takes days or weeks or months. And even them can be reversible, but they need that, okay, protein expression is up regulated or down regulated. So we increase or decrease the protein level, or we can change even one protein type to another protein type. And these chronic changes are quite often divided in acclimation, acclimatization, a phenotypic plasticity, and phenotypic flexibility. Well, these acclimation and acclimatization, they look very similar. And the latter one is the one that happens in the nature. So we have animals that are acclimatized in the cold environment, are living there in the darkness, because in Finland it's also very dark in the winter time. But then in the acclimation, we can make the same process in laboratory, where we are just changing one environmental factor. So that's why we have cold acclimated animals that are having as much light as these warm acclimated. So there is only one factor that has been changed. And then we have this plasticity. So we have the same genes, etc., but they have some genes are upregulated and downregulated. So they are quite flexible, these animals. And then we have these evolutionary changes that can be affected directly. So it's effect on gene frequencies, and that happens after multiple generations on the new in the new environment. And of course, these kind of changes are not reversible. And then we have these internally programmed changes. We can have development changes. So animals are developing differently depending on the environment. Or they can, if there is a lack of food, they might, some animals can develop a little bit differently than when there is plenty of food available, or when there is a different temperature on some crocodiles are either male or female depending on the temperature, etc. Or then we can have also changes controlled by periodical biological clocks. So that's why several of our body functions are different in the nighttime and daytime, or in several animals that they are active in the reproduction only on certain time of the year. Then, last but not least, we also have animals has a factor like size. So, an environment affects completely different way in animals that are large or animals that are small. Because when you increase your body weight, you also increase a little bit your body size, and then that means that there is less area directly connected to the environment. But if you are very small, you evaporate heat very easily, and that's why your several of your body functions must be a little bit different. And that's why, for example, over here we have the length of gestation. So how long time these animals are having the babies in their stomach. And as you can see, that very large animals, they carry the babies a little bit longer time than the small ones. Thank you.